November 12, 1944, the Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Staff Sergeant James McKinney crouched in a shallow foxhole on a ridgeline overlooking a snow-dusted valley, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Through his binoculars, he watched a column of German armor assembling in a tree line nearly 10 miles to the east. Panther tanks. At least a dozen. They were preparing to counterattack American positions. McKinney reached for the radio handset of his SCR-610, the 35-pound backpack radio that had become as essential to him as his rifle. His radio man, Private First Class Eddie Torres, hunched beside him, adjusting the frequency. The static cleared. McKinney pressed the transmit button. Fire Direction Center, this is Observer 23. Fire mission. Grid coordinates 478291. Enemy armor, battalion strength. Request immediate fire for effect. His voice was calm, measured, betraying nothing of the knowledge that if those tanks rolled forward unopposed, they would overrun 2 companies of American infantry, dug in 3 miles behind him. Men he had eaten breakfast with that morning, men who trusted that when death came rolling toward them in steel, someone would stop it. 7 miles to the rear, inside a converted barn that served as the battalion fire direction center, Second Lieutenant Robert Chen heard McKinney's transmission and grabbed a grease pencil. Around him, organized chaos erupted. 3 enlisted men hunched over a large plotting table covered with maps and acetate overlays. Telephones rang. Another radio crackled with traffic from a different observer. Cigarette smoke hung thick in the air. Chen plotted the grid coordinates on his firing chart. His mind performed calculations that would have taken hours just a decade earlier, but years of training at Fort Sill had made the mathematics instinctive. Target distance, azimuth. Elevation corrections for the difference in altitude between the guns and the target, wind speed and direction, air temperature, even the rotation of the Earth. Compute firing data for all batteries, Chen ordered. Full battalion shoot. This was the moment that defined modern artillery. One forward observer, miles from the guns, was about to bring down the coordinated fire of 4 entire batteries, 18 M105mm howitzers, 72 shells screaming through the air simultaneously toward a target the gunners themselves would never see. The system that made this possible did not spring fully formed from some general's imagination in the heat of battle. It was built methodically, deliberately, over more than a decade of peace, by artillery officers who understood that the next war would demand solutions that did not yet exist. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story begins not in the forests of Germany, but on the wind-swept plains of Oklahoma, at a military installation that would transform American artillery from a collection of individual gun batteries into the most devastating fire support system ever devised. Fort Sill, Oklahoma. Established in 1869 during the Indian Wars, the post had evolved into the home of American artillery. By the late 1920s, it housed the United States Army Field Artillery School, where artillery officers came to learn their craft. The mission was straightforward: to provide theoretical and practical instruction on the latest weapons and fire direction procedures. But there was a problem, a fundamental problem that plagued every army that employed artillery. When guns fire at targets beyond visual range, indirect fire, as it's called, coordination becomes maddeningly difficult. Each battery commander controlled his own guns, directing fire independently based on his own observations or orders from higher command. If a commander needed concentrated fire from multiple batteries on a single target, the process was slow, complicated, and often ineffective. Imagine trying to get 4 different orchestras, each playing in a separate room, to perform the same symphony in perfect synchronization without a conductor. That was the state of American artillery in 1928. Major Carlos Brewer saw the problem clearly. Appointed director of the gunnery department at Fort Sill in 1928, Brewer was a graduate of West Point who had spent his career thinking deeply about artillery. He had missed combat in World War I, assigned instead to teach at the academy, a frustration that would haunt him for years. But that teaching experience had given him something valuable: time to study, to analyze, to question assumptions that everyone else accepted as immutable facts. Brewer looked at the current system of massing artillery fire and recognized it was fundamentally broken. Battery commanders operated almost autonomously. When multiple batteries needed to engage the same target, each battery commander had to compute his own firing data independently. Coordination was achieved by designating an easily identified terrain feature, a crossroads, a distinctive building, and having each battery aim at that reference point. This method was imprecise, time-consuming, and wasteful. What if, Brewer asked, there was a better way? What if instead of each battery computing its own firing data independently, all the calculations were done in one central location? A place where specialists could plot targets, compute firing solutions, and transmit precise instructions to every gun in the battalion simultaneously. The idea seemed radical because it contradicted decades of artillery doctrine. Battery commanders were supposed to be autonomous, making their own decisions, directing their own fires. Centralizing fire direction would strip them of much of that authority, reducing them to executors of orders, calculated elsewhere. But Brewer understood something his contemporaries did not. Artillery was becoming too complex for the old system. New guns had longer ranges. Shells travelled farther, which meant more variables to account for. The math required to hit a target 8 or 10 miles away was considerably more complicated than hitting something at 2 miles. And if you wanted multiple batteries to hit the same target at the same time on target as it would later be called, the calculations became exponentially more difficult. Beginning in 1928, Brewer and his instructors began developing what they called a firing chart. Instead of describing targets by reference to visible terrain features, they plotted battery positions and target locations on a detailed map using survey techniques to determine exact coordinates. This allowed them to calculate precise distances and directions mathematically, rather than estimating by eye. They introduced the practice of locating battery positions by careful survey, using specialized equipment to determine exact coordinates and elevations. Previously, batteries had simply set up wherever convenient and estimated their position. Now, every gun emplacement was surveyed as precisely as if engineers were laying railroad track. They designated targets with reference to a base point on the firing chart rather than visible landmarks. This allowed for targeting locations that no one could actually see: hidden valleys, reverse slopes, areas obscured by forests or darkness. In the spring of 1931, Brewer's gunnery department successfully demonstrated massing battalion fire using these new methods at Fort Sill. For the first time, 18 guns from 3 separate batteries delivered coordinated fire on a single target with a precision that astonished observers. The shells arrived nearly simultaneously, creating a concentration of explosive force that no single battery could match. This was the beginning, but Brewer knew the firing chart and survey methods solved only half the problem. The real revolution required something more: a new organizational structure that would centralize command and control while maintaining the flexibility to respond rapidly to targets of opportunity. That innovation came from Brewer's successor as director of the gunnery department, Major Orlando Ward. Taking over from Brewer in the early 1930s, Ward built upon the foundation his predecessor had laid. Ward formalized what would become known as the Fire Direction Center, a dedicated team of specialists whose sole job was computing firing data for the entire battalion. The FDC would be the nerve center of the artillery battalion. Instead of battery commanders acting as independent operators, they would become conductors, executing fire missions planned and coordinated by the FDC. Forward observers, men like Staff Sergeant McKinney in the Hürtgen Forest, would radio target information not to individual batteries but to the FDC. The FDC would determine which batteries should fire, compute all necessary data, and issue firing orders to the guns. This changed everything. The battalion commander, previously more administrator than warrior, now had direct control over massed fires. He could shift artillery support rapidly from one sector to another. He could concentrate overwhelming firepower on critical targets. Most importantly, he could ensure that every gun in his command fired accurately on first salvo, because all calculations came from specialists using the best available data rather than harried battery commanders computing under pressure in the field. By 1934, the Fire Direction Center concept had been thoroughly tested and refined. The field artillery community recognized that Brewer, Ward, and their colleagues at Fort Sill had created something revolutionary. But like many military innovations developed in peacetime, it remained largely theoretical. Paper exercises and training demonstrations proved the concept worked. Whether it would function under the chaos of actual combat remained unknown. Through the 1930s, as storm clouds gathered over Europe and Asia, Fort Sill continued refining the system. They developed standard procedures, trained officers and enlisted men in FDC operations, created firing tables and calculation aids to speed the mathematical process. They prepared for a war they hoped would never come but knew was inevitable. Then came December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. America was at war. Suddenly, the theoretical innovations developed at Fort Sill over the previous decade became urgently practical. The Army needed artillery officers and enlisted men by the thousands. Fort Sill expanded rapidly, transforming from a school into an industrial training operation. Courses that once took months were compressed into weeks. New firing ranges were constructed. Barracks sprang up across the reservation. But the Fire Direction Center concept remained central to everything taught at Fort Sill. Every artillery officer learned FDC procedures. Every forward observer learned how to call for fire through the FDC. Every enlisted man trained as a computer, the military term for the specialists who performed the calculations, learned the mathematical procedures that made coordinated fire possible. The transformation of American artillery was not just organizational. It required new technology, specifically, new communications technology that would prove as revolutionary as the FDC itself. Because a centralized fire direction system was worthless if forward observers could not communicate with the FDC reliably and quickly. This is where radio entered the story. Battlefield radio communications in the 1920s and early 30s were primitive, unreliable, and heavy. Radios weighed hundreds of pounds, required elaborate antenna systems, and had ranges measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles. Forward observers still relied primarily on telephone lines, reels of wire they laid as they advanced, connecting them physically to battalion headquarters. Wire communication had severe limitations. Artillery preparation before an attack severed friendly wire lines as reliably as it destroyed enemy positions. Advancing infantry frequently cut through the lines. Enemy artillery deliberately targeted communication routes, and wire offered no flexibility. If a forward observer needed to move to a better vantage point, someone had to lay new wire. The solution emerged from an unexpected quarter, a civilian company in Chicago. Galvin Manufacturing Corporation, which would later become Motorola, had been developing portable radio technology for police departments. In 1940, one of their engineers, a man named Don Mitchell, created something remarkable, a handheld, self-contained two-way radio that weighed just 5.5 pounds. The Army signal. Corps immediately recognized its potential. They designated it the SCR 536, though soldiers would give it a more memorable name, the Handy Talkie. It operated on frequencies between 3.5 and 6 MHz, had a range of about 1 mile under good conditions, and was powered by batteries that lasted roughly a day of normal use. The soldier simply pulled out the antenna to turn it on, pushed a button to transmit, and released to listen. Production exploded. By July 1941, the SCR 536 was in mass production. Over 130,000 units would be manufactured during the war. Infantry companies received at least 6, 1 for each rifle platoon commander, 2 for the weapons platoon, and 1 for the company commander. Artillery forward observers carried them as well, providing a backup to their primary radios and allowing communication with the infantry they supported. But the handy-talkie's 1-mile range limited its usefulness for artillery spotters who needed to communicate with FDCs that might be 5 or 6 miles to the rear. For that, the Army needed something more powerful. That requirement led to the development of the SCR-300, what soldiers would call the walkie-talkie. Galvin's engineering team, led by Daniel Noble and Henryk Magnuski, designed the SCR-300 around a revolutionary technology for military radios, frequency modulation, or FM. Previous military radios used amplitude modulation, AM, which was subject to static, interference, and signal degradation. FM provided clear, interference-free communication even in difficult conditions. The SCR-300 operated on frequencies between 40 and 48 MHz. It had an effective range of approximately 3 miles, varying with terrain. At 35 pounds, it was heavy enough to require a specialized operator, but light enough for one man to carry in a backpack. Crucially, it included features specifically designed for artillery operations, adjustable squelch circuits to reduce static, automatic frequency control, and perhaps most importantly, radio relay capability. Radio relay was the feature that truly extended the reach of forward observers. 2 SCR-300s could be connected with special cables, allowing one radio to automatically retransmit signals received by the other. This created relay stations that could extend communication range far beyond the 3-mile limit of a single radio. In practice, this meant a forward observer with an SCR-300 could communicate with a relay station 3 miles back, which automatically retransmitted his signal to the FDC another 3 miles farther to the rear. The observer's effective range had doubled. Add another relay station, and ranges of 9 miles or more became achievable. This was the trick that extended artillery communications, not a single innovation, but a system of technologies working together. Forward observers also used other radios. The SCR-610, mounted in jeeps, provided longer range and more reliability for observers working from relatively fixed positions. The SCR-619 combined multiple radios into a single vehicle-mounted system, but the principle remained constant. Reliable radio communication between observers and fire direction centers enabled the entire system to function. By 1943, American artillery had become a precisely coordinated force unlike anything the world had ever seen. The organizational innovation of the Fire Direction Center, combined with advances in radio communications, created a system where a single forward observer could request fire missions from any artillery unit within range of his target. The process worked like this. A forward observer, positioned with infantry at the front line, identified an enemy position through binoculars. He determined the target's grid coordinates using a map and compass, or BI, calculating distance and direction from his own position. He radioed the Fire Direction Center. Fire mission, grid 478291. Enemy armor, battalion strength. At the FDC, specialists plotted the target on their firing chart. They determined which batteries were in range. They computed firing data for each gun, accounting for range, elevation differences, meteorological conditions, propellant temperature, even the Earth's rotation. They transmitted firing orders to the batteries. Battery A, deflection 2850, quadrant elevation 325, charge 5, 1 round HE. At my command, the gun crews, miles from both the target and the observer, cranked their howitzers to the specified settings. They loaded shells and powder charges. They waited for the fire command. Fire. 18 guns erupted simultaneously. 72 shells arced through the sky, following nearly identical trajectories calculated to converge on a single point. The observer watched through binoculars as the shells impacted. If adjustments were needed, he radioed corrections back to the FDC. Add 100, write 50. The FDC recomputed, transmitted new firing data, and the guns fired again. When the observer was satisfied with the adjustment, he gave the command that meant certain death for whoever was unfortunate enough to be at the target location. Fire for effect. Now the full fury of American artillery descended. All 18 guns in the battalion fired rapid salvos. Perhaps additional battalions joined in, called by the FDC to mass even more firepower. Hundreds of shells crashed down on an area the size of a football field. Nothing survived. Tanks were destroyed, infantry shredded, fortifications obliterated. This capability made American artillery the most feared weapon on any battlefield where US forces operated. German soldiers learned to dread the appearance of American forward observers. They called them artillery magnets and targeted them ruthlessly, knowing that destroying the observer disrupted the entire American fire support system. The life expectancy of a forward observer in combat was measured in weeks, not months. They operated at the front lines, exposed to everything the infantry faced, but with the additional burden of being priority targets for enemy snipers, artillery, and mortars. They carried radios that made them conspicuous. They spent time at observation posts studying the enemy through binoculars, exposing themselves to be spotted. Yet men like Staff Sergeant James McKinney in the Hürtgen Forest volunteered for the duty. They understood their importance. When American infantry advanced against prepared German defences, success depended on artillery support, and artillery support depended on forward observers who could see the target, call for fire, adjust the rounds, and bring overwhelming firepower to bear on enemy positions. The system worked because every element functioned in concert. The Fire Direction Center provided the coordination and computational power. Radio communications provided the link between observers and the FDC. Trained crews at the guns executed firing orders with precision. And forward observers, the eyes of the artillery, identified targets and adjusted fire. No other combatant in World War II developed a system comparable to the American Fire Direction Center. The Germans, whose artillery was technically sophisticated and well-trained, still operated on a more decentralized model. Each battery commander retained considerable autonomy. German forward observers typically communicated directly with their own battery rather than through a centralized coordination center. The British experimented with fire direction centers, but never implemented them as systematically as the Americans. Soviet artillery, while massive in quantity, relied more on pre-planned barrages than responsive fire direction. Only the Americans had created a system where one observer could, within minutes, bring down the fire of an entire division's artillery, dozens of batteries, hundreds of guns, all coordinated through fire direction centers operating at battalion, division, and corps level. A German officer who experienced American artillery in Normandy later wrote that it was like fighting under a rain of steel that never stopped, that could find you anywhere, that arrived minutes after American troops spotted you. This was not an accident. It was the deliberate result of innovations developed over 15 years by artillery officers who had the vision to see what modern warfare would demand and the determination to develop solutions before the shooting started. The system saved countless American lives. Infantry advancing with artillery support available on call suffered fewer casualties than those attacking without it. Conversely, German formations caught in American artillery barrages were devastated. After action reports from Normandy, Italy, and later Germany itself consistently praised American artillery for its responsiveness, accuracy, and sheer destructive power. Eisenhower later remarked that American artillery was one of the decisive factors in Allied victory. Bradley called it his Sunday punch, the weapon he relied on to break German defences when infantry alone could not. Patton, who had himself been an artilleryman early in his career, repeatedly praised the fire support that enabled his armour to advance at speeds that astounded friend and foe alike. The numbers tell the story. In a typical American infantry division, there were 4 artillery battalions with a total of 48 howitzers. Add in attached battalions at corps level, and a division might have access to 100 or more guns. Through the Fire Direction Center system, a single forward observer could request and receive fire from all of them. The time from request to first rounds on target averaged 3 to 5 minutes under good conditions, sometimes faster. Compare that to German artillery in the defensive battles of 1944 and 1945, where response times of 15 to 20 minutes were common, assuming the request even reached the guns through damaged communications networks and ammunition shortages. American artillery also had other advantages. Production capacity meant ammunition was rarely scarce. American gunners could fire 5 or 10 times as many shells as their German counterparts without worrying about conservation. Industrial capacity provided more guns, more trucks to move them, more prime movers to tow them, more radios to coordinate them. But quantity alone was not sufficient. The Soviet army had more artillery than the Americans. The Germans, for much of the war, had technically superior guns. What made American artillery supreme was the system, the organizational innovation that turned individual gun batteries into a coordinated precision instrument capable of delivering devastating fire support wherever and whenever infantry needed it. That system was born at Fort Sill in the 1930s, refined through the early years of the war, and perfected on the battlefields of North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany. It changed artillery from a supporting arm into the dominant killer on the battlefield. By war's end, artillery accounted for more casualties than any other weapon system, more than machine guns, more than tanks, more than aircraft. And at the heart of that system were 3 elements working in perfect synchronization. The Fire Direction Center, computing firing data with speed and precision impossible for individual battery commanders. Radio communications, linking observers miles ahead with the FDC and the guns miles behind. And forward observers, the men who climbed the ridgelines, crawled through the mud, and risked death daily to be the eyes of the artillery. Staff Sergeant James McKinney watched through his binoculars as the first salvo from the battalion's howitzers screamed overhead. The sound was distinct, a rushing freight train roar that every infantryman learned to recognize and pray would pass over rather than fall short. 72 shells arced across the grey November sky, their trajectories invisible but their destination certain. The impacts erupted in the tree line where the German armour had assembled. Orange flashes bloomed among the pines, black smoke billowed upward. McKinney counted, 12 seconds between firing and impact. The guns were approximately 7 miles behind him. He made a mental note of the time, information the Fire Direction Center would want for future calculations. On target, he reported into his radio. Good effect. Fire for effect. Repeat fire for effect. Lieutenant Chen, back at the FDC, acknowledged and gave the order. The guns would fire continuously now, pouring shells into that grid square until McKinney called for them to stop or shift to a new target. This was the power of the system. One man on a ridgeline could orchestrate destruction miles away against an enemy he could barely see. McKinney had not always been a forward observer. He had started the war as an ordinary infantryman, a rifleman in the 29th Infantry Division. He had landed at Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, wading through chest-deep water while German machine guns turned the surf red. He had survived that day through luck, and the fact that American artillery, firing from ships offshore, had eventually suppressed enough German positions to allow the infantry to advance off the beach. After Omaha, after the hedgerows of Normandy, where every field was a separate battlefield, after Saint-Lô, where American bombers accidentally killed their own troops before artillery cleared the way forward, McKinney had volunteered for forward observer training. He had learned why. He had seen what happened when artillery support was available and what happened when it was not. The difference was measured in body bags. The training had been intense. 3 weeks at a replacement depot where artillery instructors taught him map reading, radio procedures, target identification, and the mathematics of fire direction. He learned to read terrain, to estimate distances by eye, to calculate deflection and range from his position to a target. He learned radio discipline, how to transmit clearly under stress, how to compress information into brief messages that minimized time on air and reduced the chance of enemy radio direction finding. Most importantly, he learned to trust the system. The forward observer never saw the guns he was controlling. He never met most of the men in the Fire Direction Center. He communicated with voices on a radio, people he knew only by call signs. Yet he had to trust absolutely that when he called for fire, the shells would arrive where he wanted them, not on his own position or on friendly troops. That trust was built on training, on standardized procedures that everyone followed regardless of circumstances. The FDC used the same plotting methods, the same firing tables, the same correction factors across the entire army. A forward observer trained at Fort Sill could work with any artillery battalion in any division because everyone spoke the same language, used the same grid system, followed the same protocols. This standardization was itself an innovation. In earlier wars, artillery units developed their own methods, their own shorthand, their own procedures. An observer from one division could not effectively call for fire from another division's guns because they operated differently. The FDC system imposed uniformity that made the entire artillery force interoperable. McKinney kept his binoculars focused on the target area. Through the smoke and snow, he could see secondary explosions, ammunition cooking off. One of the tanks was burning. The others were attempting to withdraw, backing deeper into the forest. He adjusted his aim point. Shift fire. Left 200. Add 100. Continue fire for effect. The correction reached the FDC within seconds. Chen and his team recomputed the firing data, accounting for the shift in target location. New firing orders went to the gun crews. The next salvo fell exactly where McKinney had directed it, blocking the Germans' line of retreat. This responsiveness was what made American artillery so deadly. From request to adjustment to follow-up fire, the entire cycle took minutes. German artillery, operating without centralized fire direction, often required 15 minutes or more to shift targets. By the time their shells arrived, American troops had moved. German commanders complained bitterly about American artillery's ability to engage targets almost instantly and maintain accurate fire indefinitely. The secret was not just the fire direction center or the radios. It was the integration of both with a third element that often goes unmentioned. The industrial production system that kept the guns supplied with ammunition. American factories produced artillery shells by the millions. Ships brought them across the Atlantic. Trucks distributed them to forward ammunition dumps. When McKinney called for fire for effect, he never worried whether the battalion had enough shells to respond. There were always more shells. German artillery, by contrast, operated under constant ammunition restrictions. Forward observers were instructed to call for fire only on critical targets. Fire for effect was rationed. Batteries might be limited to 10 or 20 shells per day. This forced German artillery into a reactive posture, responding to emergencies rather than proactively supporting infantry operations. American forward observers faced no such restrictions. If infantry needed artillery support, they got it. If a target appeared, they engaged it. The supply system ensured that shells reached the guns faster than the guns could fire them. This abundance, combined with the Fire Direction Center's ability to coordinate fire and radio's ability to transmit requests instantly, created an artillery force that was both overwhelming and responsive. The German tanks had stopped trying to withdraw. McKinney could see crew members bailing out, running from their disabled vehicles into the forest. The counterattack had been stopped before it began. He keyed his radio. Cease fire. Target destroyed. Estimate 10 to 12 enemy vehicles destroyed or abandoned. Infantry movement in the tree line. Approximately company strength, dispersing to the northeast. Chen acknowledged. Good work, 2-3. Stand by for possible additional fire missions. McKinney settled back into his foxhole. His radio man, Torres, was grinning. You think you got them all? Enough, McKinney said. Enough that they won't be attacking today. This was November 1944. The war in Europe would continue for another 6 months, through the Battle of the Bulge, where American artillery played a crucial role in blunting the German offensive. Through the crossing of the Rhine, where artillery preparation made the impossible possible, through the final collapse of German resistance in the spring of 1945. Throughout those months, the system developed at Fort Sill in the 1930s, and refined through years of combat, would prove itself again and again. American artillery would be called upon tens of thousands of times. Forward observers would direct millions of shells onto German positions. The fire direction centers would compute firing data with mechanical precision. The radios would carry messages through static and interference and enemy jamming, and men would die. Not just Germans caught in the bombardments, but also the forward observers who made those bombardments possible. McKinney would survive the war, one of the lucky ones. Many of his fellow observers would not. The casualty rates among forward observers exceeded those of infantry riflemen, themselves the most dangerous job in the army. Why did men volunteer for such duty? The answers varied. Some, like McKinney, had seen firsthand what artillery could do and wanted to be the ones controlling that power. Some wanted the prestige that came with being the most powerful individual in the forward area, as an army manual described the forward observer. Some simply wanted to contribute to victory in the most direct way possible. Whatever their motivations, these men were the essential link in a chain that connected American industrial might to battlefield success. The factories that produced the shells, the ships that carried them to Europe, the trucks that brought them forward, the guns that fired them, the fire direction centers that aimed them. All of it was useless without forward observers willing to climb the ridge lines, occupy the observation posts, and call down fire on the enemy. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The innovations that made this system possible extended beyond the organizational structure of the Fire Direction Center and the technology of FM radios. They included changes to artillery doctrine, training methods, and even the design of the weapons themselves. Take, for example, the M105mm howitzer, the standard artillery piece of American divisions. It was not the most powerful gun of the war. German 150mm howitzers threw heavier shells. Soviet artillery pieces came in calibers the Americans never attempted. But the M105 was perfect for the American system. It was mobile. Weighing just over 2 tons, it could be towed by a 2.5-ton truck at speeds up to 35 miles per hour on roads. This mobility allowed artillery battalions to keep pace with advancing infantry and armor, maintaining close support throughout offensive operations. It was reliable. The design was simple, robust, and tolerant of rough handling. Guns could fire thousands of rounds without major maintenance. Crews could operate them in desert heat or winter snow. When something did break, repairs were straightforward and parts were plentiful. It had a high rate of fire. A well-trained crew could fire 4 rounds per minute sustained, higher for brief periods. This rate of fire, multiplied across a battalion of 18 guns, meant that American artillery could deluge a target with shells faster than most enemies could respond. And crucially, it was standardized. Every division used the same gun, the same ammunition, the same fire control procedures. This interchangeability meant that forward observers did not need to know which specific battalion was supporting them. All M105 battalions operated identically. All used the same firing tables. All could be controlled through the same fire. Direction center procedures. The ammunition was equally standardized. High explosive shells for general purposes, white phosphorus for smoke screens and anti-personnel effects, illumination rounds for night operations, anti-tank rounds, though these were rarely needed by the time American forces were advancing into Germany. Every type of ammunition had known characteristics, carefully documented in firing tables that fire direction centers used to compute accurate firing data. The shells themselves represented another technological achievement. American proximity fuses, VT fuses in military nomenclature, allowed shells to explode at a predetermined height above the ground rather than only on impact. This airburst effect was devastating against infantry in the open. A shell bursting 20 feet above the ground showered shrapnel downward over a wide area. Troops in trenches or foxholes, safe from shells that buried themselves before exploding, were vulnerable to airbursts. VT fuses were closely guarded secrets. Forward observers were instructed to use them only when the chance of duds falling into enemy hands was minimal. The fuses contained miniature radar systems that detected the ground and triggered detonation at the optimal height. This technology, developed in America and Britain, gave Allied artillery yet another advantage over German guns. But technology alone did not win battles. It required training, discipline, and coordination to employ these weapons effectively. The Fire Direction Center concept worked only because everyone involved understood their role and executed it precisely. Consider the complexity of a typical fire mission. The forward observer identifies a target and estimates its grid coordinates. He radios this information to the Fire Direction Center, along with a description of the target type, size, and activity. The FDC receives this transmission and plots the target location on their firing chart. An FDC specialist, the horizontal, the control operator, determines range and azimuth from the gun positions to the target. Another specialist, the vertical control operator, calculates elevation corrections based on the difference in altitude between guns and target. A third specialist consults meteorological data, wind speed and direction at various altitudes, air temperature, air density. These factors all affect shell trajectory. The computer, a soldier trained in the mathematical procedures, combines all this information using firing tables and slide rules or mechanical calculators. He produces firing data, the compass direction each gun should aim, the elevation angle for the barrel, the powder charge to use, the type of fuse to set on the shell. This data is transmitted to the gun crews, either by radio or telephone. Each crew cranks their howitzer to the specified settings. The gunner verifies the aim. The ammunition handlers prepare the shells, setting fuses to the designated time or impact sensitivity. The powder handlers prepare the propellant charges, using exactly the amount specified in the firing order. On command, all guns fire simultaneously. The shells travel in arcs miles long, reaching altitudes of several thousand feet before descending toward the target. Variations in powder temperature, barrel wear, or loading procedure cause slight differences in each shell's trajectory, which is why artillery fires multiple rounds rather than single shots. The forward observer watches the impacts and radios corrections. Add 50 means the shells fell 50 meters short and elevation should be increased. Right 100 means the shells landed 100 meters to the right and azimuth should be adjusted. The FDC recomputes, issues new firing data, and the guns fire again. This process repeats until the observer is satisfied with the accuracy. Then comes the fire for effect order, and the guns shift from adjustment mode to maximum rate of fire. Shell after shell arcs downrange, blanketing the target area with high explosive and steel fragments. All of this happens in minutes, and it happens because every person involved has been trained to execute their specific task without hesitation or error. The forward observer knows how to adjust fire. The FDC specialists know how to compute data. The gun crews know how to aim and load. The system functions because every component works in concert, like an orchestra where every musician knows the score perfectly. Training for this level of proficiency required months. Forward observers spent weeks learning map reading, radio procedures, and target identification before they ever called for real fire. FDC personnel drilled on plotting and computation until they could perform the calculations reflexively under pressure. Gun crews practiced loading and aiming until they could execute fire missions in complete darkness or under artillery bombardment. Fort Sill, where the Fire Direction Center concept had been developed, became the crucible where this training happened. Thousands of artillery officers and enlisted men passed through Fort Sill during the war years. They learned not just the technical skills, but the doctrine, the philosophy that made American artillery different from everyone else's. That philosophy emphasized massed fires, concentration of force, and responsive support. American artillery doctrine held that it was better to obliterate a target with overwhelming firepower than to conserve ammunition and risk leaving the enemy functional. It was better to fire quickly and adjust than to delay while computing perfect data. It was better to support infantry aggressively than to hold artillery in reserve. This aggressive, responsive approach required trust between infantry and artillery. Infantry commanders had to believe that when they requested fire support, it would arrive quickly and accurately. Artillery commanders had to believe that infantry would use fire support wisely, not calling for barrages on trivial targets. That trust was built through training exercises where infantry and artillery worked together, through shared experiences in combat, and through the demonstrated effectiveness of the system. After a few engagements where artillery support saved infantry from disaster or enabled them to capture objectives with minimal casualties, the trust became unshakable. German soldiers captured in Normandy and later battles frequently commented on American artillery. They described it as the most feared weapon they faced, more terrifying than tanks or aircraft, because it could strike anywhere at any time. A German infantryman might hide from a tank in a cellar or wait out an air raid in a bunker, but American artillery found you wherever you were and kept firing until nothing remained. This psychological impact was as important as the physical destruction. German troops became reluctant to concentrate in large formations, knowing that American observers were watching for exactly such targets. They became hesitant to counterattack, knowing that the moment they left their defensive positions, artillery would catch them in the open. They became demoralized by the constant bombardments that arrived within minutes of American troops spotting them. The American artillery system also enabled tactical innovations that would have been impossible with less responsive fire support. Infantry could advance behind a rolling barrage, a curtain of shells that moved forward at a predetermined rate, suppressing German positions just long enough for American troops to close and assault. This technique, perfected in World War I, worked far better with the FDC system because the precise timing required could be coordinated across multiple battalions. Artillery could also execute time-on-target missions, where shells from multiple batteries, even multiple battalions positioned miles apart, arrived on the target simultaneously. This required extraordinary coordination. Shells fired from different distances traveled for different lengths of time. The FDC had to compute not just the firing data, but the exact moment each gun should fire so that all shells arrived together. The result was a devastating initial salvo that gave the enemy no warning and no time to take cover. These techniques, combined with the abundance of ammunition and the responsiveness of the system, made American artillery the dominant weapon on the European battlefield from Normandy to the Elbe. Eisenhower's statement that American artillery was one of the decisive factors in Allied victory was not hyperbole. It was sober assessment based on after-action reports, casualty statistics, and the testimony of both American commanders and German prisoners. The innovations developed at Fort Sill in the 1930s had proven themselves under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The Fire Direction Center concept worked exactly as its designers had envisioned, enabling coordination and massed fires that no other army could match. The integration of radio communications had solved the problem of linking forward observers with the guns. The training programs had produced skilled personnel who could execute complex fire missions under pressure. But the human cost was real and substantial. Forward observers, the men who made the system work, paid a terrible price. They operated at the front lines where casualties were highest. They exposed themselves to observe the enemy. They carried radios that made them conspicuous targets, and the Germans, recognizing how critical forward observers were to American artillery, targeted them ruthlessly. Staff Sergeant James McKinney survived the war, but many of his fellow forward observers did not. After the war, McKinney would sometimes talk about the men he had served with, the radiomen and fellow observers who had shared foxholes with him, who had huddled beside him in observation posts, who had called for fire to save infantry companies from being overrun. Too many of those men never came home. Yet McKinney never regretted his service as a forward observer. He had seen what artillery could do. He had watched German attacks crumble under massed fires. He had seen American infantry advance successfully because artillery had suppressed the defenders. He had saved lives by calling down fire on enemy positions before they could threaten American troops. In his later years, McKinney would reflect on the strange nature of modern warfare, where a man on a ridgeline with a radio could orchestrate destruction miles away, where mathematical calculations determined life and death, where victory depended as much on coordination and communication as on courage and firepower. The system that made this possible, the Fire Direction Center integrated with radio communications and forward observers, was one of the unsung innovations of World War II. It receives less attention than radar or the atomic bomb, less glory than tanks or aircraft. But in terms of its impact on the battlefield, in terms of its contribution to Allied victory, American artillery stands alongside any weapon system of the war. And it all began with a simple question asked by artillery officers at Fort Sill in the late 1920s. What if there was a better way to coordinate artillery fire? What if instead of autonomous battery commanders operating independently, we centralized fire direction in a specialized team? What if we used survey techniques to plot targets precisely? What if we employed radio to link observers with the guns? Those questions, and the solutions developed over more than a decade of peacetime innovation, transformed artillery from a supporting arm into the dominant killer on the battlefield. They gave American commanders a weapon that could strike anywhere, anytime, with devastating accuracy and overwhelming force. They saved countless American lives and helped bring World War II to a victorious conclusion. The legacy of those innovations continues today. Modern artillery still uses fire direction centers, now computerized but operating on the same fundamental principles developed at Fort Sill in the 1930s. Forward observers still call for fire using procedures that would be recognizable to Staff Sergeant McKinney. The integration of sensors, communications, and weapons into a coordinated system remains central to military effectiveness. The story of American artillery in World War II is ultimately a story about innovation, about how dedicated professionals working in peacetime developed solutions to problems that would only become critical in war. It is a story about systems thinking, about recognizing that the whole can be greater than the sum of its parts if the parts are properly coordinated. It is a story about training and standardization, about creating procedures that work reliably under the chaos of combat. And it is a story about the men who made the system work, the forward observers who climbed the ridgelines, the FDC specialists who computed the firing data, the gun crews who loaded and aimed and fired, again and again, through campaigns that stretched from North Africa to Germany. They did not fight for glory. Most would never receive medals or recognition. They fought because they understood that war is won not by individual heroism, but by coordinated effort, by systems that work, by professionals executing their duties with precision and dedication. Staff Sergeant James McKinney, watching through binoculars from a ridgeline in the Hürtgen Forest, was one small part of a vast system that spanned continents. Behind him lay factories producing shells, ships carrying ammunition, trucks distributing supplies, training schools preparing replacements. Ahead lay the enemy, equally determined, equally brave, but lacking the coordination and firepower that American artillery provided. When McKinney called fire that November morning in 1944, he was not just directing 18 howitzers. He was the end point of a chain of innovation that stretched back 15 years, to a time when artillery officers at Fort Sill asked themselves how artillery could become more effective. He was employing technologies developed by civilian engineers and military researchers. He was executing procedures taught to thousands of men at training schools across America. And he was saving lives, American lives, the lives of infantrymen who depended on artillery to suppress German positions, the lives of tank crews who needed artillery to destroy anti-tank guns, the lives of medics and engineers and supply troops who were vulnerable whenever German counterattacks broke through. That was the purpose of the system. Not the elegant mathematics of ballistics or the technological sophistication of FM radios or the organizational efficiency of fire direction centers. The purpose was to bring American soldiers home alive, to give them the tools and support they needed to defeat an enemy that was skilled, determined, and well-equipped. American artillery succeeded in that mission. It was not perfect. Mistakes happened. Friendly fire incidents killed American and Allied troops. Equipment failures disrupted fire missions. Communication breakdowns delayed critical support. But overall, the system worked. It worked well enough that American artillery became feared by enemies and relied upon by friends. It worked well enough that it became a model for post-war artillery development worldwide. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.